World War I was a global conflict that changed the world forever. It was fought from 1914 to 1918, a period of just over 4 years, but its impact is, well, still felt today. This war was called the Great War, and also the war to end all wars, because honestly, nothing like it had ever happened before. It involved countries from every continent, and it was fought on a scale that was previously unimaginable. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, and entire empires that had stood for centuries just crumbled into dust. The war introduced new and terrifying technologies of destruction, fundamentally altering the nature of combat and really, human society itself. The main fight was between two major groups of countries. On one side were the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. They were a powerful bloc located in the heart of Europe. On the other side were the Allied powers, often called the Entente. This group was larger and included Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Japan, and later, the United States. Many other nations joined the Allies as the conflict grew, creating a truly worldwide struggle for dominance. These alliances were complex and had been forming for many years before the fighting actually started. The war was fought across many different places called fronts. The most famous was the Western Front, a long line of trenches that stretched through France and Belgium. This is where millions of soldiers lived and died in just terrible conditions. But there was also an Eastern Front where Germany and Austria-Hungary fought against Russia. Fighting also took place in the mountains between Italy and Austria, in the Balkans, and in the Middle East. The war even reached Africa and Asia, as European colonial powers used their empires to supply soldiers and resources for the fight. This essay will take you on a chronological journey through this immense conflict. We will explore why the war started, looking at the long-term tensions and the single event that, lit the fuse. We will follow the major battles and see how the fighting evolved over the years. We'll look at the critical year of 1917, which completely changed the direction of the war. Finally, we will examine how the war ended and what its lasting consequences were for the world, from redrawn maps to new international organizations designed to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. Before a single shot was fired, Europe was like a powder keg just waiting for a spark. Several powerful forces had been building up for decades, creating an atmosphere of deep tension and rivalry. One of the biggest forces was militarism. This was the belief that a country should have a strong military and be ready to use it to defend or promote its interests. Countries like Germany and Britain were in a naval race, each trying to build more powerful warships than the other. Armies were growing larger, and generals were creating detailed plans for a war they believed was inevitable. This focus on military strength made war seem like a good solution to political problems. Another key cause was the complex system of alliances. European nations had been forming secret and public agreements with each other for protection. The two main alliances were the Triple Entente, which was Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These were like teams. If one country was attacked, its allies were sworn to help defend it. While these alliances were meant to keep the peace by creating a balance of power, they actually made a large-scale war more likely. A small conflict between two nations could quickly pull in all their allies, turning a local dispute into a massive, continent-wide war. Imperialism also played a huge role in the growing tensions. The major European powers were competing for colonies and resources all over the world, particularly in Africa and Asia. This race for empire created rivalries and distrust. Germany, a relatively new nation, felt it had been left behind in the scramble for colonies and wanted its place in the sun. This ambition often brought it into conflict with Britain and France, who already had vast overseas empires. The competition for land, wealth, and global influence added another layer of fuel to the fire, making diplomatic solutions to disputes much harder to find. Finally, there was the powerful force of nationalism. This is the strong belief that your own country is better than others, and it sometimes includes the desire for people of the same ethnic group to have their own nation. In regions like the Balkans in southeastern Europe, many different ethnic groups were ruled by the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. These groups, like the Serbs, wanted independence. This created a very unstable situation, earning the region the nickname the powder keg of Europe. Nationalism made people fiercely loyal to their country and willing to fight for it, but it also created deep hatred and suspicion between different nations. The fragile peace of Europe was shattered on a single day, June 28, 1914. On that day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was visiting the city of Sarajevo. Sarajevo was the capital of Bosnia, a region that Austria-Hungary had taken over. This angered many Serbian nationalists who believed Bosnia should be part of a new independent Serbian state. The Archduke's visit was seen as an insult and a show of Austrian power. For a group of young Serbian nationalists, it was an opportunity they simply could not miss. They planned to make a statement that the world could not ignore. The Archduke and his wife, Sophie, were traveling in an open-topped car through the streets of Sarajevo. The assassins, part of a secret society called the Black Hand, had positioned themselves along the route. The first attempt to kill the Archduke failed. A bomb was thrown at his car, but it bounced off and exploded under the car behind, injuring several people. The Archduke was shaken, but decided to continue with his visit after a short stop at the town hall. He was determined not to be intimidated by the threat, a decision that would prove fatal for him and his wife. In a strange twist of fate, the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn while trying to get to a hospital to visit the people injured in the first attack. As the driver tried to reverse the car, it stalled right in front of a cafe. By pure chance, one of the assassins, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, was standing there. He had thought the assassination had failed and was likely contemplating his next move. Seeing his target just a few feet away, Princip seized the moment. He stepped forward, drew his pistol, and fired 2 shots at close range. The first bullet hit Sophie in the abdomen, and the second struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. They both died within minutes. The assassination sent shockwaves across Europe. Austria-Hungary was outraged and blamed the Serbian government for supporting the terrorists. They saw this as a direct attack on their empire. Gavrilo Princip was arrested immediately, but the act itself was the spark that would ignite the powder keg of European tensions. The world held its breath, waiting to see what Austria-Hungary would do next. The path to war was now wide open. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, events moved very quickly, like a line of dominoes falling one after another. Austria-Hungary was determined to punish Serbia. They believed that the Serbian government had secretly supported the assassins, even though there was no direct proof. With the strong backing of their powerful ally Germany, Austria-Hungary sent a harsh ultimatum to Serbia on July 23, 1914. This was a list of 10 demands, designed to be so tough that Serbia would have no choice but to reject them, giving Austria-Hungary an excuse to declare war. Serbia, a small nation, knew it could not fight Austria-Hungary alone. It looked to its traditional protector, Russia, for help. The Serbs surprised everyone by agreeing to almost all of the Austrian demands, except for one that would have allowed Austrian officials to investigate the assassination inside Serbia. They argued this would violate their independence as a nation. For Austria-Hungary, this partial rejection was enough. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The first domino had fallen, and the war had officially begun. The declaration of war set off the chain reaction of alliances. Russia, seeing itself as the defender of Slavic peoples like the Serbs, began to mobilize its massive army to support Serbia. Germany saw this as a direct threat. They had a war plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, which called for a quick attack on France first, before turning to fight Russia. To make this plan work, they needed to act fast. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. Germany knew that France was Russia's ally, so they didn't wait. 2 days later, on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. The German plan required their army to march through neutral Belgium to get to France. This was the final step that brought Britain into the war. Britain had a treaty from 1839 guaranteeing Belgium's neutrality and was also worried about a powerful Germany controlling the coast of mainland Europe. When German troops crossed the Belgian border on August 4th, Britain delivered an ultimatum to Germany to withdraw. Germany refused, famously calling the treaty a scrap of paper. In response, Britain declared war on Germany later that day. In just over a week, a local conflict in the Balkans had exploded into a major European war. In the first few weeks of the war, everyone believed the fighting would be over by Christmas. The German army swept through Belgium and into northern France, following their Schlieffen Plan. They were heading for Paris, hoping to defeat France quickly. The French and British armies retreated, trying to slow the German advance. The Germans got very close to Paris, but they were exhausted, and their supply lines were stretched thin. The decisive moment came in early September 1914 at the First Battle of the Marne. The French army, in a desperate move, rushed soldiers to the front line, famously using Parisian taxis to transport thousands of troops. The Battle of the Marne was a turning point. The Allied counterattack stopped the German advance and saved Paris. Both sides realized that a quick victory was now impossible. Following the Marne, a period known as the Race to the Sea began. Each army tried to outflank the other, moving north towards the North Sea coast. They were trying to get around the side of the enemy's line, but every time one side moved, the other side moved to block them. This race ended in a stalemate, with a continuous line of armies facing each other from the coast of Belgium all the way to the border of Switzerland. With neither side able to advance, the soldiers began to dig into the ground for protection. This was the beginning of trench warfare, the defining feature of the Western Front. Soldiers on both sides dug complex networks of trenches protected by machine guns and barbed wire. The area between the two opposing trench lines was called No Man's Land. It was a desolate, muddy, and terrifying place, filled with craters from artillery shells and the bodies of fallen soldiers. Life in the trenches was horrific, with constant danger from shelling, sniper fire, and disease. The early fighting was incredibly brutal, with battles like the First Battle of Ypres in late 1914 causing huge casualties. At Ypres, the experienced British professional army was almost wiped out. The war of movement that the generals had planned for was over. A new static and deadly form of warfare had begun. For the next 4 years, millions of men would be trapped in this miserable landscape of mud and death, fighting over tiny patches of ground in battles that cost hundreds of thousands of lives for very little gain. The Christmas of 1914 came and went, with the soldiers still in their trenches. As the stalemate on the Western Front became entrenched, both sides looked for other ways to break the deadlock. The war expanded to new fronts and saw the introduction of, well, horrifying new weapons. In 1915, the Allies launched a major campaign in the Ottoman Empire, hoping to open a new front and knock one of the Central Powers out of the war. This was the Gallipoli campaign. The plan was to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula to open a sea route to Russia through the Dardanelles Strait. The campaign was, unfortunately, a disaster. The Allied forces, mainly from Australia and New Zealand, the Anzacs, Britain, and France, were met with fierce Turkish resistance. The fighting was brutal, and the Allies suffered heavy losses before finally withdrawing in failure. The same year, Italy, which had initially been part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, decided to join the war on the side of the Allies. Italy had been promised territory from Austria-Hungary if the Allies won. This opened up a new mountainous front along the border between Italy and Austria. The fighting here was incredibly difficult, taking place in the high Alps. Soldiers had to battle not only the enemy but also the extreme cold, snow, and avalanches. The Italian front became another bloody stalemate, with both sides launching numerous costly offensives that gained very little ground. The year 1915 also saw a terrible new development in warfare: the use of poison gas. At the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans released clouds of chlorine gas against French and Algerian troops. The gas caused suffocation and horrific injuries, creating panic and breaking the Allied line. Gas was a terrifying and unpredictable weapon, as a change in wind could blow it back onto your own troops. Both sides quickly developed gas masks and began using their own chemical weapons, including mustard gas, which caused terrible blisters on the skin and in the lungs. This new technology added another layer of horror to the soldiers' experience. The year 1916 was defined by two of the bloodiest battles in human history. The first was the Battle of Verdun, launched by the Germans with the aim of bleeding the French white. The battle lasted for 10 months and resulted in over 700,000 casualties. To relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun, the British and French launched their own major offensive, the Battle of the Somme. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, their worst single day in history. The Somme lasted for months and cost over 1 million lives, becoming a symbol of the war's senseless slaughter. On the Eastern Front, Russia's Brusilov offensive was a huge success initially but ultimately failed due to a lack of supplies. The year 1917 was a critical turning point in World War I. Two major events happened that completely changed the balance of power and the course of the conflict. The first was the Russian Revolution. Years of devastating losses, food shortages, and political unrest finally boiled over in Russia. In March, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate his throne. A provisional government took over but decided to continue the war, which was, honestly, an unpopular decision. By November, a second revolution led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power. They promised the Russian people peace, land, and bread. One of Lenin's first actions was to take Russia out of the war. In early 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. This was a harsh peace treaty that gave Germany control over vast territories in Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, Finland, and the Baltic states. For the Central Powers, this was a huge victory. They no longer had to fight a two-front war. They could now move hundreds of thousands of their best troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front in France. They planned to use these reinforcements to launch one final massive attack to win the war before the Americans could arrive in large numbers. The second major event of 1917 was the entry of the United States into the war. For the first 3 years, the US had remained neutral, although it did provide supplies and loans to the Allies. Public opinion began to shift against Germany due to several factors. One was Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare. German U-boats were sinking ships without warning, including passenger liners like the Lusitania in 1915, which killed over 100 Americans. The final straw was the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico, intercepted by the British. In it, Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the US if America entered the war. When this telegram was made public, Americans were outraged. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. While the US Army was small and needed time to train and transport its troops to Europe, its entry was a massive boost for the tired Allies. It brought fresh soldiers, vast industrial resources, and a huge psychological lift. The Allies now knew that time was on their side. The war became a race. Could Germany defeat Britain and France on the Western Front before the full might of the United States could be brought into the fight? The stage was set for the final, decisive phase of the conflict. With Russia out of the war, Germany saw its chance for a final victory. In the spring of 1918, they launched a series of massive attacks on the Western Front, known as the German Spring Offensive, or Kaiserschlacht, Kaiser's Battle. Using new tactics with specially trained stormtroopers, the Germans broke through the Allied lines in several places. For the first time in years, the static trench lines were broken, and the war became one of movement again. The Germans pushed deep into Allied territory, getting closer to Paris than they had been since 1914. It seemed for a moment that they might actually win the war. However, the German offensive ultimately failed. Although they made huge gains, they could not deliver a final knockout blow. Their soldiers were exhausted, and they had suffered enormous casualties. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and they could not bring up enough food and ammunition to keep the attack going. The Allies, though battered, did not break. Under a new unified commander, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, they managed to hold the line. At the same time, fresh American troops were arriving in Europe at a rate of over 250,000 per month, tipping the balance of power decisively in the Allies' favor. Starting in the summer of 1918, the Allies launched their own series of counterattacks, known as the 100 Days Offensive. Using new combined arms tactics that coordinated infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft, the Allies began to push the Germans back. The Battle of Amiens on August 8 was a major success, described by the German commander as the Black Day of the German Army. From that point on, the German army was in constant retreat. Their morale collapsed. They were running out of soldiers and supplies, while the Allied armies were growing stronger every day with American reinforcements. By the autumn of 1918, Germany's allies were collapsing. Bulgaria surrendered in September, followed by the Ottoman Empire in October. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart as different ethnic groups declared their independence. At home in Germany, the people were starving due to the British naval blockade, and revolution was in the air. The German military leaders told the Kaiser that the war was lost and that he must seek peace. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. 2 days later, on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the new German government signed an armistice, an agreement to stop the fighting. After 4 long years, the guns on the Western Front finally fell silent. The end of the fighting did not mean an end to the suffering. World War I was one of the deadliest conflicts in history. It is estimated that around 10 million soldiers were killed, and another 20 million were wounded. Millions of civilians also died from starvation, disease, and military action. A whole generation of young men, the lost generation, was scarred physically and psychologically by the horrors they had witnessed in the trenches. The Spanish flu pandemic, which spread rapidly among tired and malnourished populations in 1918 and 1919, killed millions more people worldwide, adding to the immense tragedy of the era. The war also completely redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. 4 great empires had collapsed: the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian. In their place, new countries were created, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The victorious powers led by Britain, France, and the United States met in Paris in 1919 to decide the terms of the peace. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed with Germany. The treaty was very harsh. It forced Germany to accept full blame for the war, pay enormous reparations, payments for war damage, give up its colonies, and drastically reduce the size of its military. The Treaty of Versailles was intended to prevent Germany from ever starting another war, but many historians believe it created deep resentment and economic hardship in Germany, which helped to create the conditions for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of World War II just 20 years later. The peace treaties also carved up the old Ottoman Empire, creating new borders in the Middle East that often ignored the ethnic and religious groups living there. This has led to instability and conflict in the region that continues to this day. One of the few hopeful outcomes of the war was the creation of the League of Nations. This was an idea promoted by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. The League was an international organization where countries could meet to solve their disputes peacefully, through diplomacy rather than war. It was the world's first attempt at creating a global system for collective security. Although the League ultimately failed to prevent World War II, partly because the United States itself refused to join, it was an important first step. It laid the foundation for the United Nations, which was created after the Second Great Global Conflict, in the enduring hope of achieving lasting world peace.